The palace chamber was quiet, with faint sounds of the waking kingdom drifting in through the open window. Jafari sat cross-legged on the floor with his son, a small wooden toy in hand. The boy's giggles echoed in the quiet chamber as Jafari made exaggerated movements with the toy, pretending it was a mighty warrior fending off invisible foes. "And then the brave warrior said," Jafari began in a dramatic voice, "I will protect the kingdom no matter what." The boy clapped his hands and laughed. "No, Papa," he'd say, "I will fight the bad man." Jafari paused, a knot forming in his chest at the word Papa. It felt strange and wonderful, like a new garment he was still getting used to wearing. "Oh? The bad man? You think he's brave enough for that?" he teased. The boy nodded vigorously. "Yes, because he's just like me." Jafari couldn't help but laugh, ruffling the boy's afro. "I bet you're the bravest fighter in all the kingdoms." The boy's smile faltered slightly, and he looked down at the toy in his hands. "Papa?" he asked quietly, his small voice hesitant. "Yes, my little warrior," Jafari replied, leaning closer. The boy's eyes, so much like his own, lifted to meet Jafari's. "Why did you leave me?" Jafari's heart sank. The question struck him deeply, and for a moment he couldn't find his voice. He began, his throat tightening. He set the toy aside and reached for the boy's small hands. "I made a mistake, a very big mistake, and I'm so sorry." The boy's brow furrowed, his expression thoughtful. "But you're here now?" Jafari nodded, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. "Yes, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The boy studied him for a moment longer before nodding, as if accepting Jafari's answer. Then his face broke into a bright smile. "Okay, but next time, don't leave." Jafari let out a shaky laugh, pulling the boy into his arms. "Never," he whispered, holding him close. From the doorway, the Dark King watched silently. His arms were crossed, and his expression was unreadable, but there was a softness in his eyes. As Jafari and the boy laughed together, the Dark King turned and walked away, his heart light. A gentle breeze whispered through the gardens, carrying the faint buzz of insects and the rustle of leaves as Arogo sat on a carved stone bench, her hands folded in her lap. She looked out at the vibrant flowers, swaying gently in the breeze, but her mind was far from the serene beauty surrounding her. Jafari approached hesitantly, his steps quiet on the garden path. The sight of her made his chest constrict, not from love, but from guilt. She looked so poised, yet there was a heaviness in her gaze that he couldn't ignore. "Arogo," he said softly, drawing her attention. She turned, her expression unreadable. "Jafari." He gestured to the space beside her. "May I sit?" She nodded, her gaze returning to the flowers as he settled onto the bench. For a moment they sat in silence, an unspoken tension lingering between them. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Jafari began, his voice full of hesitation. Arogo let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Apologies are easy, Jafari. Living with the consequences, that's the hard part." Her words stung, but he knew she was right. "You're not wrong, and I know there's nothing I can say to undo the hurt I caused. But I'm sorry for everything, for leaving, for not responding to your letter, for making you carry all of this alone." Arogo's hands tightened around the folds of her dress. "Do you have any idea how hard it was?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Raising a child alone? Explaining to him why his father wasn't there? Watching him grow up and seeing pieces of you in him and hating those pieces because they reminded me of how much I lost?" Jafari's throat tightened and he looked down at his hands. "You're right. I can't imagine. And I'll never forgive myself for putting you through that. Arogo exhaled deeply, her shoulders slumping slightly. I loved you, Jafari, or at least I thought I did. But deep down, I always knew you didn't love me back, not the way I wanted you to. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with regret. You deserved someone who could love you the way you deserved to be loved. And I failed you in that too. She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I think I've come to terms with it. What I need now is closure, to let go of the hurt and move forward. Jafari nodded slowly. You deserve that, and if there's anything I can do to help. Arogo's eyes softened as she studied him. I don't need anything from you except honesty, and maybe a little understanding. The moment stretched between them, delicate and fragile. Then she shifted, her voice taking on a curious tone. You and the Dark King, you're obviously in love. It's written all over your faces. Jafari's face warmed, but he didn't deny it. We are. She tilted her head, a flicker of amusement in her expression. Why him? Of all people, why the Dark King? Jafari's lips curved into a soft smile. Because I see the man he is now, not the man he used to be. He's strong, compassionate, and fiercely loyal. He's given me the courage to be myself, to face my past instead of running from it. And I just love him. Arogo's brow furrowed slightly. But he's the Dark King. People see him as a monster. Jafari's gaze softened further. Then maybe they should get to know him better, like you. She blinked, startled. Me? He's a good man, Jafari said earnestly. And I think you'd see that if you gave him a chance. Arogo considered his words, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she nodded. Maybe, for the boy's sake at least. Whether I like it or not, he's going to be a part of our son's life. They sat together in the quiet of the garden, the memory of past wounds still present, but beginning to lift. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The dining hall was quiet. With everyone having retreated for the evening, Arogo sat alone at the far end of the long table, her fingers idly tracing the rim of a silver goblet. There was too much on her mind to go to sleep yet. Jafari's brother, Prince Baraka, entered the hall, his presence filling the space with a quiet intensity. He hesitated when he saw her, his steps faltering as if debating whether to turn back. But after a brief pause, he squared his shoulders and approached. Arogo, he said, do you mind if I join you? She looked up, startled, her lips parted as if to refuse, but instead she nodded. Of course. Baraka settled into the chair beside her, his movements deliberate. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence stretching between them like a taut string. Finally, Baraka cleared his throat. I've been wanting to talk to you, he admitted, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. Arogo's brow creased gently. About? He glanced down at his hands, then back at her. About us, about me. Arogo inclined her head, her curiosity piqued. Go on, she urged. Baraka exhaled deeply, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. I've loved you for as long as I can remember, he confessed, his voice trembling slightly. Ever since you moved into the palace after Mosey's birth, but I knew that you loved my brother and were still heartbroken, so I buried my feelings because I did not want to burden you more. I've carried these feelings for years, and it's been difficult to keep them hidden. Arogo's eyes widened, her breath catching. Baraka, He held up a hand, stopping her. Let me finish. I'm not telling you this to make you uncomfortable or to demand anything from you. I just needed you to know. I've carried this for so long, and I think it's time I let it go. For a moment, Arogo was silent, her emotions warring within her. Finally, she spoke. "I had feelings for Jafari once," she admitted, "but they were fleeting. I think I always knew he couldn't give me what I wanted, and over time, I've come to see you in a different light, too." Baraka's gaze snapped to hers, surprise and hope flickering in his eyes. "You have." She nodded, a shy smile playing on her lips. "Yes, you've been so kind, so steady. You've always been there for me and my son. I think I'd like to see where this could go." And he struggled to suppress the grin spreading across his face. "You have no idea what that means to me," he said, his voice full of emotion. They sat together in the quiet hall, a new understanding blossoming between them. Neither rushed to fill the silence, content to let the moment speak for itself. The palace was silent, the night draped in shadows as Jafari sat on the balcony outside one of the living rooms. The cool breeze played with the edges of his robe, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were pressing, circling around his son, Arogo, and the pieces of his past that were slowly coming together in unexpected ways. A faint knock from the direction of the house pulled Jafari from his reverie. Before he could respond, the balcony door creaked open and Baraka stepped outside. His silhouette was briefly framed by the dim corridor light before he hesitated at the threshold, his expression uncertain. "Is this a bad time?" Baraka asked, his voice quieter than usual. Jafari shook his head and gestured for his brother to join him. "No, it's fine. Come on." Baraka walked over and leaned against the balcony railing. The quiet stayed between them, charged with many emotions. Finally, Baraka broke it. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice tinged with regret. Jafari looked at him, surprised. "An apology?" Baraka nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkened horizon. "For how I treated you when we were younger, when I found out about you, being different." He exhaled deeply, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I sided with father because it was easier, because I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't understand, and instead of trying to, I pushed you away." A deep, twisting sensation gripped Jafari's chest, memories of those painful days flashing through his mind. "You were my brother," he said, his voice raw. "I expected that from father, but not from you. You were supposed to be on my side. I was heartbroken, Baraka." Baraka turned to him, his expression pained. "I know, and I failed you. I've regretted it every day since you left. It wasn't until much later that I realized how much I hurt you." Jafari's eyes glistened, but he refused to let the tears fall. "You stopped being my brother first," he said, his voice trembling. "That's why I left." Baraka's hand tightened on the railing. "I was wrong. I was scared and ignorant, and I let that get in the way of what mattered. I want to fix this, Jafari. I want to be your brother again. That's why I came." Jafari looked at him, his defenses wavering. The raw sincerity in Baraka's voice was something he hadn't heard in years. Finally, he nodded, his voice fragile. "I've missed you." Baraka's shoulders relaxed, and a small smile broke through his otherwise serious expression. "I've missed you too." They stood quietly for a brief moment before Baraka's tone turned lighter. "But I have to ask, why the Dark King? Out of all the men in the world, why him?" Jafari's lips twitched into a smile. "You wouldn't understand." Baraka raised an eyebrow. "Try me." "He's not the man people think he is," Jafari said simply. "And he's made me feel more loved and accepted than anyone ever has. That's all you need to know." Baraka chuckled, shaking his head. Fair enough. But seriously, he burned down his own kingdom. That's a little hard to overlook. Jafari playfully swatted at his brother's arm. Get to know him before you judge. Baraka grinned, his laughter breaking the tension that had existed between them. All right, but just know, if he ever hurts you, he'll have me to answer to. Jafari's smile widened and he pulled his brother into a tight hug. For the first time in years, it felt like they were truly brothers again. As they pulled apart, Baraka gave Jafari a teasing look. So, how would you feel if Arogo and I, became a thing? Jafari's eyes widened, his jaw nearly dropping. Wait, what? Is that a thing? Baraka chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Not yet, but I have feelings for her, and I have hope. Jafari stared at his brother for a long moment, his thoughts racing. The mother of his child and his brother? It was strange, almost surreal. But as he processed it, he realized he wasn't angry. Well, he said slowly, if anyone's going to be with her, I guess I'd rather it be someone I trust. Baraka smiled, a hint of relief in his eyes. Thanks, Jaf. The courtyard glowed with the warm hues of sunset, the sky streaked with oranges and purples that seemed to stretch endlessly. The air was filled with the soft murmur of voices and the occasional laughter of the palace servants moving about. Jafari, the Dark King, and Jafari's son sat together under the shade of a sprawling baobab tree, their plates filled with simple but comforting fare. The boy was animated, his hands moving wildly as he recounted a story about a warrior he'd seen in the clouds earlier that day. Jafari listened with a smile, occasionally glancing at the Dark King, who sat quietly but attentively, his hand resting lightly on Jafari's. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Not far away, Arogo stood with Prince Baraka near the edge of the courtyard, watching the scene unfold as she took in the sight of her son, his laughter echoing through the space. Baraka leaned in slightly, his voice low. They look happy. Arogo nodded, her features relaxed. They do. For the first time in ages, it feels peaceful. Baraka smiled, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before turning back to his brother. I'm glad he's trying. Jafari has always been stubborn, but when he cares, he gives it everything. As the evening deepened, Baraka broke away from Arogo and approached the Dark King. The Dark King looked up as he approached, his expression guarded but curious. Can I have a word? Baraka asked. The Dark King nodded, rising to his feet. They stepped a few paces away, far enough to speak privately, but still within sight of the others. Baraka crossed his arms, his tone casual but edged with something firmer. You've been living with my brother for a while now. The Dark King tilted his head slightly, unsure of where this was going. That's true. And yet you haven't reached out to his family to introduce yourself or ask for permission, Baraka continued, his brow raising. Don't you think that's a bit disrespectful? My family might be wealthy, but we're not without our traditions. The Dark King blinked, momentarily caught off guard. I didn't realize that was an option. Given the nature of our love. Baraka's lips twitched into a smirk. Relax, I'm just messing with you. The Dark King exhaled, a small chuckle escaping him. You're quite the joker, aren't you, Prince Baraka? But Baraka's smile faded, his tone turning serious. No, but seriously, I personally don't like you, given everything you've done. But for my brother's sake, I'm willing to give you a chance. You seem to make him happy. Just know, all of that goodwill ends if I ever hear you've hurt him. The Dark King's gaze met Baraka's, absorbing his words. I understand your concerns, and I can assure you I love your brother deeply. He is my world, and I intend to honor and cherish him for as long as I live." Baraka nodded, satisfied, and clapped the Dark King on the shoulder. "Good. Now let's eat. I'm starving." They returned to the group, where the boy was now climbing onto Jafari's lap, his energy seemingly endless. Arogo joined them, taking a seat beside her son and ruffling his afro with a fond smile. As twilight deepened and the horizon turned a deep orange, the group settled into a comfortable rhythm. Laughter rang out as the boy made silly faces, and even the Dark King's usually stoic expression softened into a smile. Arogo and Baraka shared a quiet conversation, their voices low but warm, while Jafari leaned against the Dark King, their connection a steady anchor in the growing twilight. The evening closed with a sense of unity, fragile but genuine. For the first time in years, it felt as though the pieces of their lives were beginning to fit together, not perfectly, but enough to hold. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more stories. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and hit the subscribe button.